Yeah, ready to start. So we got lots to cover as usual, and not enough time. We have so many good things to talk about. We have reached almost the end of this sweeping history of the Reformations, as we have discovered. It's not just one Reformation. Um, it's been such a good time. I've had a great time. Paul's had a great time. Kathy's had a great time. We've learned a lot in the process, and we've got one more installment today from our guest, the Reverend Dr. Ben Payne. Dr. Payne is academic dean and the Duncalf Villalobos Professor of Church History at Seminary of Southwest. His current areas of research and expertise are the Oxford movement, so a great reforming movement in the Anglican tradition where we still live with today. I mean, I'm wearing a chasuble up there. That's not something that the reformers in the 16th century would have been a fan of. Particularly the theology of John Henry Newman, which, as you might know, just was named the 38th Doctor of the Universal Church, in which Dr. King was a really central part of that process. You were one of two non-Catholic scholars that presented this information to the Pope to finalize this, and actually went to Rome and met the Pope. So which hand shook the Pope's hand? That hand shook the Pope's hand just a few weeks ago. Very cool. So we're so glad to be here today. He's author of two books, Newman and the Alexandrian Fathers, and one of Templeton Award for Theological Promise. And lots of other really, really wonderful things. You can learn more about him if you talk to him a little bit later today. But by way of quick review, to give us some context for what he's going to talk about today, we talked about the English Reformation, how Henry was a particularly conservative reformer. He did not really want to change much about the worship and liturgy and theology at first. His son, Edward VI, was not that way. He was surrounded by evangelical and reformed voices, and the Church of England swung in that direction during his reign, which was very short. He died very young, and then his sister Mary, Roman Catholic stronghold, comes back and reinstitutes Roman Catholicism in England, burns a lot of Protestants, and then she dies before people were expecting her to. And then her sister Elizabeth I comes in and creates what would later be referred to as the Elizabethan settlement, which is a retention of much of the Reformed evangelical theological convictions of her brother, while retaining some elements of what would broadly be considered Western Catholic tradition, like bishops, liturgy, vestments, using your hands during the Eucharist, those kinds of things. So that settlement hung around for a little while until the English Civil War, when Puritans took control, beheaded the king, banned the Book of Common Prayer, and England was a Puritan-led and Puritan-worshipping society for a long time. And this was right after the American colonies were starting to form. So these conflicts, these theological conflicts were happening over here too. But after that, the 1662 prayer book comes in, reestablishes Episcopal bishop government in the church, and we're going to see what that turns into in America. Thanks.
We are very blessed to have such a great curate and such a great seminarian who are, I hope, a sign of what good work we do at Southwest. So thank you so much for inviting me to come speak. You may have detected from the accent that I'm not originally from these parts, but I am actually an American citizen, so I'm with you all when it comes to kicking out the king. And we're going to have to speak a little bit about that, the Revolutionary War, as we, based on that wonderful introduction from Anthony, bring the story to these shores of how the Episcopal Church was founded. There's a cartoon here, which, I don't know, this is what passed for entertainment in 1760, but this is meant to be a funny cartoon of the plot to land a bishop, is what it's called. And I don't know if you can see, but towards the far side of the slide, you see a bishop climbing up the rigging of a ship, being sent packing back to England. And he is saying the prayer that we say in Evensong in the prayer book, the Nunc Dimittis, Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace. In other words, get me out of here. And where he's fleeing from is, I don't know, Boston or New York or something like that. Some place where he is not wanted on these shores. And that is because bishops, by the time of the 1760s, were anathema to revolutionary patriots in this country, in the colonies, soon to become the nation of the United States. And this, in the 1760s, was precisely the time when the Church of England finally got its act together and wanted to install bishops in this land. And here's the shocking thing, as Anthony just pointed out, so much of the history of Anglicanism, so much of the history of the Church in England has been about keeping bishops through the Reformation settlements, keeping bishops as the number one way in which the church was led. And yet, by 1760, these colonies still had not had a bishop present. The bishop for the colonies was the Bishop of London, which is quite a long way away from the colonies. One, and two, was arguably the busiest job of any bishop in the Church of England. So this guy who was already overcommitted was expected to be in charge of all of the colonies. But this is how we encounter the, if you like, precursor to the Episcopal Church, which is to say Anglicanism in the colonies. It is non-episcopal. There ain't a bishop in the colonies. And it's also strangely congregational, which is to say congregations, and that is the lay people within the congregations rule the roost. So let's talk a little bit about what in the early part of the 1700s, the precursor to the Episcopal Church would have been like. So here we go. I notice every time I used to do that, the poor people on the screen get to see the back of my head, but that's all right. It's not going to be my best sign. So the Bishop of London is in charge of the colonies, and he can't run the show. And so what does he have to do? He sends a group of people whom we call commissaries to do the work for him. Now, commissaries, we need to get bogged down on, especially in this context, but it's a medieval term. It's going back to the medieval church that was, how bishops were, if you like, someone in place of them who can do the stuff of basically administering the church. But a commissary is not a bishop and therefore cannot do the things that bishops do. What do bishops do? Any of you remember? What are some of the things that bishops are able to do? Yeah. Confirmation. Well, I thought someone was going to say talk a lot. Ordained priest. Well done. This is fantastic. So confirmation and ordination. Anything else you can think of? When you see a bishop, what's the bishop coming to do normally?
Confirmation.
Yeah, we've done confirmation. That was a good one. Just having a visitation, right? Coming in, checking up on people. Yeah. Making sure that everything is simpatico in the parish. The Cathy is keeping everybody shipshape, right? That sort of checking in with the clergy, checking in with the parish was not able to happen if your bishop was on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. And these commissaries, although they did do a bit of administration in the absence of the bishop, couldn't do all those other things that you so rightly pointed out. I've got on the screen a picture of one such commissary. This is a guy by the name of James Belair. And you can see he's got a very nice wig that he wears. He is also a wig with a HW HIG. He is a Scottish latitudinarian. We don't need to go into what that means. It's sort of he's sort of a bit liberal on his doctrine. And the reason that he is in America is that he didn't get on very well with the authorities back in the United Kingdom, back in Scotland and England. And so he's come over to the colonies, and this is sadly the case. As brilliant as some of these people might be, they were not normally wanting to be in the colonies. They would have much preferred to be in some prestigious position in the Church of England. Nevertheless, he ends up coming over to the colony of Virginia, and what he does is set up convocations for the clergy so that they can get together and talk about how difficult it is to be a clergy person in the colonies. He is the rector of Bruton Parish. Have any of you been to Colonial Williamsburg? Yeah, exactly. So you will recognise that as the parish in the centre of Colonial Williamsburg. He is an enslaver, as many white colonists were in this period. He's also responsible for founding the College of William and Mary, and some of you have nodded your familiarity with that very prestigious institution. And he is, on the whole, a success as being a commissary, which is why he does the job between 1689 and 1746. But this is not the equivalent of a bishop, as I said. And these commissaries, there are 9 of them in all in the various colonies, are not the same as episcopal governors. I've also mentioned the congregational nature of colonial Anglicanism, which is to say that the congregations are really not terribly well connected one with another. And within each congregation, it's not the priest who holds sway so much as it is the laity. Okay, so this is good for you all, lay people. You all have a lot more in America, a lot more influence over the choice of your rector, over the institution or appointment of your rector, than was the case in the Church of England. In the Church of England, it was really left to the bishop to make the decision, or the person who owned the living, the benefice, as it was called in the Church of England. For you all, it was you who instituted a rector, and if you decided you didn't actually want a rector, you didn't have to have one. And so I told you that the Bishop of London is rather a busy man, because he can't visit the various parishes in the colonies. He instead sends out questionnaires to find out how they all get along as clergy. And they all write back and say, oh, it's terrible. One person who's a Hunger's parish writes back, the parish will not induct me because they will not be confined to a minister. So these are Anglicans who know that Anglicans have bishops, priests, and deacons, but they don't actually want a priest. They don't want to give this person the authority of being the parish minister. Instead, they want to run the show as a vestry. I'm sure that's not busy. Now, I mentioned by the 1760s, finally, the light bulb is going off back in England that there should be bishops in the colonies. But by this stage, it is too late. So when the Archbishop of Canterbury, Archbishop Secker, decides that the time has come to have bishops in the colonies, that's what I mean by colonial episcopate, the British government says, no way. This is much too dangerous. Because by this stage, and here the cartoon says it all, the colonists don't want a bishop. The colonists think of bishops, who in the Church of England are also lords, as a hierarchical entity. They're going to be kings, they're going to be tyrants in their diocese. And I pointed out the congregational nature of colonial Anglicanism means that most lay people don't want a king, don't want to be told what to do by a lordly bishop. And so the timing is very poor on the part of Archbishop II. And indeed, by 1782, in the build-up to the first bishops that come to pass in the Episcopal Church, by this stage having broken away from England and no longer as British colonies, but as states, the first bishop ends up making this statement. Right, this is in advance of himself becoming a bishop. I'll explain how that happens in a moment. But this guy named William White calls it a fact universally known that the laity were opposed to having bishops. So how in the world did we end up with an Episcopal church, a church run by bishops? Well, that's what I'm about to tell you. So before I do, I just want to give you a heads up that another organization is busy bringing the Church of England to the colonies in this period. And that is a body called the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, or SPG. And it is connected with a missionary organization also out of London called the SPCK, the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge. The SPG, its shield, you see to one side here. This is from a stained glass window in New Jersey, but it's a sort of offensive shield. We just have to name that. There are a bunch of Native Americans you can possibly see who are busy crying out they want to be saved. Okay. And here, lo and behold, are some nice, friendly white people coming to save them by giving them the gospel. So this is how the SPG depicted what it was doing. So the number of clergy in the American colonies was small, and as I implied, often people like Blair had come because they weren't wanted back in Scotland. So quality wasn't necessarily great. They often immigrated, as I say, to reverse fortunes. Things were not going well back in the mother country. And because the quality was poor, folks back in London thought something needed to be done about it. And one of them who did was a gentleman by the name of Thomas Bray, who founded first the SPCK, which he said was founded to promote religion and learning in the plantations abroad and propagate Christian knowledge at home. That word plantation is important, right? What the British Empire claimed it was doing was planting good seed overseas, and it hoped that those good seed would grow up and outnumber the bad indigenous seed. We just need to state that plainly. But he himself, Bray, came and was the commissary in Maryland. And as a result of this, he also got to see it firsthand that the quality of clergy was not great in the colonies. And so he went back and tried to get some missionaries interested in returning. One of these you'll be maybe entertained to find out was John Wesley. John Wesley went on to become one of these missionaries who came over to Georgia and then decided he would return back to England and found a whole different denomination. But anyway, the Royal Charter for the organization that Bray subsequently founded the SPG, decided that it was going to set up churches. So some of the most famous old churches on the East Coast. I don't know if any of you have been to Boston and gone to the Old North Church, for instance, which played a very famous role in the Revolutionary War. That was originally an SPG church. So these churches were set up by seed money from the Church of England's SPG. All right. Examples of SPG missionaries. There is a guy in South Carolina whose name I don't want to risk to pronounce because it is a Huguenot name and I'm not really good at French, but I'm going to call him Francis. He was busy evangelizing the enslaved people of South Carolina until in 1712 he was told to stop by the various plantation owners and enslavers in South Carolina. So too in New York, there was a guy called Elias No, another Huguenot, himself once an enslaved person. He'd been enslaved by the French and was responsible for sailing the galley of the King of France. And maybe that's why when he emigrated to the colony of New York, he took pity on enslaved people and tried to catechize them. But once again, when there was a slave uprising in New York, No was among those who were blamed for educating enslaved people, and that whole project was shut down. Now, fast forward to the revolution. Because I know this is the bit you're all waiting for. You know, people like me get kicked out, folks with fancy accents, before we then come back a couple of years later. Everyone has forgiven everything like that. We'll find out William White goes over and gets ordained the bishop by the Church of England. Everyone is trying to get. So I told you William White will end up being the first bishop in the Episcopal Church in English succession, which is to say ordained by the Church of England. We're going to find another bishop is ordained in Scotland. His name is Samuel Seabury, because he can't actually get ordained in England. We're going to discover these two figures, White and Seabury, play a central role in the founding of the Episcopal Church. But William White, during the Revolutionary War, writes this pamphlet that you see before you, A Case of the Episcopal Churches in the United States Considered. Now, the thing you might notice in that title is that it's called the Episcopal Churches, not the Episcopal Church. And that's because each of these is to be a state church. Each colony, now become a state, is to have its own instantiation of the Episcopal Church. You'll notice the other word is considered. Right? This is a thought experiment that White is undertaking, because he knows, I referred to the cartoon on the opening slide, he knows that to have bishops is dangerous in the revolutionary period. That people don't want lords, that people don't want mini kings ruling their church. And so he's sort of tentatively putting out there the idea of having bishops lead churches in this pamphlet. All right, so we probably all know that some 2/3 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Anglican. Some of the big ones: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. These are folks who are Virginia planters who are on the vestry of their Anglican churches. But of course, they don't feel much loyalty to the king by the stage of the Revolutionary War, nor the king's church, the Church of England. So, what we find during the Revolutionary War is that the depending on where you were in the colonies, you may take a different view of bishops and of the Episcopal Church. So Anglicans tend to be revolutionaries in the middle colonies. I refer you again to Washington and Jefferson. Even though they're Anglican, their loyalty to the king has gone by this stage, and the king's religion is not to be their religion. And yet they are still going to become Episcopalians. In Virginia, in fact, the vestries are going to serve as communication networks for the patriots. This is why, I said before, Washington himself is a vestryman of his parish in Virginia. And this is where secret intelligence gets passed around about what the redcoats are up to in these vestry meetings. Here, the clergy in Virginia, which is originally an established Anglican colony, right? The Church of England is the established religion in Virginia. They are going to argue that the Anglicanism needs to be disestablished, and therefore the clergy should no longer be paid by the colony, but should be paid by the individual parishes. And this is what ends up taking place in the Revolutionary War. Different story in New England. In New England, the religion that has been established in the colonies is not Anglicanism, but it is Congregationalism or Presbyterianism, depending on your colony, or in some places, like Rhode Island, there is no established religion. So in these parts, the Anglican clergy have been funded by the SPG. So they're getting their money directly from London. And if you like, therefore, these clergy can continue to be loyal to the crown. In fact, it's probably in their best financial interest to remain loyal to the crown, given that SPG got its charter from the crown. Folks like Samuel Seabury, therefore, who's a clergyman in Connecticut, where Presbyterianism is the established religion, are going to actually be loyalists. Samuel Seabury, is a chaplain in the King's Regiment, which is a sign of quite how loyal he is to the crown. And we can see that in places like Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, but also Maryland and Virginia, clergy actually are persecuted as loyalists, and that various crimes are committed against the clergy. Can you imagine such a thing? It's terrible. It's Catholic. No, not here. But that would have been the case. If you've been praying for the king using the language that was in the Book of Common Prayer, you would have faced an angry mob in your churches. And so one of the ways they got around this, which was quite, I think, canny, they just had services for women and children, at which they would say the prayers for the king. And then when all the angry men came in, then they wouldn't say those prayers, they'd say different ones. But this way they could remain loyal to their vows, their ordination vows to pray for the king. And I told you before, I'm an American citizen, but I did originally get ordained in the Church of England, and I had to pray that I would remain loyal to Her Majesty the Queen, as she then was. And then when I became a US citizen, I was meant to forswear my allegiance to foreign potentates. But I figured that Queen of England, it's not really a foreign potentate, just a nice old lady. Everyone laughs, right? So that good, right? I think I'm good on that. I think I've got myself in trouble, but anyway. Maybe I should talk to clergy professionally. Anyway, this means that in New England, we have people who are actually a lot more theologically conservative, want the old way of doing things in the Church of England to continue, and people in the middle colonies, whom we will discover are a bit more theologically liberal. People like Jefferson, for instance. All right. So we get little glimmers of what will become the Episcopal Church during the Revolutionary War. And although, as I say, William White thinks of these as being state churches, plural, you start to see a network between these state churches growing up that will be the foundation for a whole Episcopal church that will span the various states soon after the war is won. So a little example of something that will be a network on which the Episcopal Church itself can grow is that during the war, someone named William Smith in Maryland gathered together clergy and laity. Between them, they came up with the name the Protestant Episcopal Church. This is where the name gets first used that we still have today. We tend to drop the Protestant bits and just call ourselves the Episcopal Church. But our official name is the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America, or PETUSA. We also find that folks in Virginia, Pennsylvania, keeping up with the news, figuring out what this action that Smith is doing, how that is going to impact their colonial churches. They're now new state churches. This is something that I think is really important for us as Americans to realize, is that the individual colonies didn't have much truck one with another. The way they kept in touch was like spokes in a wheel, and the hub of that wheel was London. So not much, converse took place between the colonies until the Revolutionary War meant that suddenly these new states were having to communicate one with another. But now we get people moving back and forth through various patriot networks. We get something that is set up for those clergy who have been killed in the war to care for their widows and their orphans. I don't know why that. Oh, we're missing one, aren't we? There it is. Hurrah. It's in the midst of all of this that Samuel Seabury decides, I am going to go to England to get myself ordained a bishop. The reason he does this is because in our case of the Episcopal churches in the United States considered, William White had made an absolutely terrifying suggestion. And that terrifying suggestion was that, seeing that we do not have any bishops in America, and we are at war with Britain and therefore can't return to get bishops from England, we're just going to make our own bishops. And the way we're going to do that is because the priests are going to ordain fellow priests as bishops. Now, hopefully you will learn Episcopal Church 101, and you know we don't do that. Thanks. We know someone said earlier on, one of the jobs of a bishop is to ordain clergy, right? Ordain the priests, ordain deacons. You all probably know that in order to ordain a bishop requires 3 bishops. So the idea that you get presbyters, priests, to ordain people as bishops, that's a non-starter, right? At least if you are one of these more conservative clergy like Samuel Seabury. And so when Samuel Seabury reads this part of the case that the Episcopal Church is considered, he and 10 Connecticut clergy freak out, right? They're not going to have this way of making bishops. It will transpire, this is exactly what the Methodist Church does very soon after. But it's not going to happen in the Episcopal Church. Instead, Seabury says, I'm going back to the mother country to see if I can get myself ordained a bishop. And he spends a year and a half trying to do so. But although the Revolutionary War has now ended, with the United States being set up, there is still ill will, you can imagine, ill feeling between folks in England and this newly arrived American, who, even though he had served as a chaplain in the King's Regiment, is now wanting to be a bishop in America. And so no one in England will ordain him. This is why famously Samuel Seabury has to go up to Scotland to be ordained in the Episcopal Scottish Church. We all know this, hopefully. If you don't, now I'm telling you, the first bishop to be ordained with Anglican orders was Samuel Seabury, and he was ordained in the Scottish Episcopal Church. And one of the concessions that he makes to the Scottish Episcopal bishops who ordain him is that he is going to bring a prayer book back that looks a bit different from the prayer book that various folks have been using from the Church of England, the famous 1662 book. We won't go into this in any detail, but basically, as I say, he is ordained in St Andrew's Cathedral in Aberdeen on the 14th of November, 1784. And he agrees to this thing called the Concordat, which is going to shape the Book of Common Prayer that we will introduce in the Episcopal Church in 1789. Now, he goes back to America. He calls himself the Bishop of all America. It's kind of big-headed, seeing that 10 people in Connecticut have sent him to get ordained, so whatever. Meanwhile, the clergy in the Middle Colonies have voted that William White should head over to be ordained a bishop, together with 2 other folks who we won't go into right now. And the Parliament in England has changed its mind. Now they're happy to ordain someone to serve as bishop in the United States. And so William White comes back to America having been ordained in the English succession, whereas Samuel Seabury was ordained in the Scottish succession. Now, this today is something I think we can be proud of, that we trace our roots in the Episcopal Church to both the bishops in England and the bishops in Scotland. I think that's wondrous. However, at the time, it was controversial. Okay? And here I'm going to end with a little description of the difference between these 2 bishops. So, as I said, the Connecticut clergy tend to be a bit more conservative, tend to not want so much change. After all, they were loyalists to the king initially. And so, when describing what the church should be like, Samuel Seabury, who you see here, used these words. I do not apprehend that it was the practice in the primitive church, and here he's referring to the laity electing their bishops. So he doesn't want lay people electing their bishops. And his reason, as he says, is that the government, sacrament, faith, and doctrine of the church are fixed and settled. We have a right to examine what they are, but we must take them as they are. If we newly model the government, why not the sacraments, creeds, and doctrines of the church? But then it would not be Christ's church, but our church, and would remain so, call it by what name we please. In other words, we have traditions that we cannot change. And one of those traditions is that bishops are appointed, they are not elected. William White, however, he was chaplain to the Continental Congress. He had seen how the US Constitution was made. He had realized the importance of participatory democracy. And so he thought bishops needed to be selected by their people. And so he makes this argument. The primitive churches were generally supplied by popular elections, right? By popular election, what they actually mean happened in the early churches that you would have basically a group of people proclaim that Augustine of Hippo should be made the bishop. And then yell and scream and say, Augustine, Augustine, until everybody agreed, all right, Augustine it is. So it's a sort of popular acclamation that someone be the bishop. It cannot be denied, he said, that this right was vested in numerous bodies, but it occasioned great disorders, like the sort of yelling and tumults and fighting over which bishop's going to be the bishop. We don't want that in this new participatory democracy. Instead, this can be avoided when the people shall exercise the right by election. And so instead of having these tumults, what we're going to do is actually have voting. And the same voting that we're going to use in our new constitution as a nation is also going to be used to elect bishops. And the bishops are going to serve in these things that we're going to call conventions. And initially, if William White had had his way, all the bishop would have been was the chair of the convention, the person who ensured that basically parliamentary procedure was followed. That's why, have any of you been to diocesan council? Yeah, you know, the bishop on the whole doesn't make any great statements, but just sort of sits there and hits the gavel and says the next order of business is X, Y, and Z. But we all know that bishops have quite a lot of power, right? But White's initial view, precisely to counter the argument that these are the lords of the church, was to say, oh no, a bishop is going to just be the chair of the meeting. That would have been utterly dissatisfactory to Seabury, who wants bishops to be the princes of the church, the successors of the apostles. We don't want a new model of the church. We want the old model of the church, according to Seabury. And I don't have time to go into how all this works out, but needless to say, the Episcopal Church's constitution and canons, the way we do general conventions, the way we've divided into a House of Deputies that has clergy and lay people in it, and a House of Bishops, rather than having in our general convention just one body at which a bishop presides. We have these two houses, and that's in order to give the bishops the sort of authority that Seabury wanted, while at the same time having the sort of participatory democracy that White wanted. So we needed both of these guys to found the Episcopal Church. All right, so enough from me. I don't know Do we?
I think we have some time for questions. We can go for another couple minutes.
Great. Does any of you have? Yeah.
Did they have bishops in any of the other colonies in the New World?
No, this is what was so shocking.
Yeah.
So all the colonies were basically run from the Bishop of London's office
Like Barbados, Jamaica, all the places.
until the end of the 18th century. So the first bishop for the colonies was actually the Bishop of Nova Scotia, who was ordained at the same time that Bishop William White and these two other bishops from America were. Up until that point, not so much. After that point, suddenly colonial bishops, like in Barbados, like in Jamaica, go gangbusters, get lots and lots of them. Yeah.
When the clergy was running the church and they didn't, or when the laity was running the church, they didn't want any clergy, did they celebrate the Eucharist?
They did celebrate the Eucharist, but not very often. Maybe Easter, maybe 4 times a year. But yes.
And the laity said the prayer?
Yes, I mean, the Book of Common Prayer allows for a lay reader to do morning prayer, which was always followed by the litany. And if Eucharist isn't being said, you don't really need clergy first. So it was much more lay-led. Yeah. Yeah, the back.
About this time, did the Catholic Church have its bishops and cardinals in America?
So there weren't that many Catholics. The only places where Catholics were in Maryland, where they had been tolerated at least, and in Rhode Island, where every religious group was tolerated. So there weren't that many Catholics, and so it wasn't really a problem. And most of what these Anglicans in the colonies wanted to do was not be Catholics. Catholics, they're what happened up in Canada, right? Or down in Spain, in Spanish occupied parts of the country. And so they were all bending over backward not to be like Catholics then.
Okay, thank you.
Which is a shame because I like Catholics. Yeah. But
I married one, so.
you exactly, they're great. We like Catholics. But it took 200 years to figure that out.
When was the church disestablished in Virginia?
Well, James Madison and Jefferson are both on that from the get-go. So it is disestablished very soon after the Declaration of Independence. But what you might find shocking is that the New England colonies do not disestablish even after the Declaration of Independence and the victory in the Revolutionary War. So into the 1830s, the New England colonies have established the Lutherans, which is to say Congregationalism and Presbyterianism. So this new religious liberty that we think of as part and parcel of American life only pertained in places like Virginia, which threw off the yoke of the Church of England. Yeah.
I was working with the southern colonies, North Carolina and South Carolina,
Yes.
Georgia. Florida was all Spanish, but
Yes.
what about those 3 little, they were pretty
Yes.
Anglican, or
They-
Episcopal.
Yes, they were, but someone in this period once said at South Carolina that it is too small to be a nation and too large to be an insane asylum. So that's how we developed about South Carolina. But yes, they definitely have some Episcopalians. But these are also places where lots of Scotch Irish have come and they're bringing their own sort of brands of Protestantism. So it's not surprising that Anglicanism goes away quite quickly there. In fact, I didn't put this stat on the slides, but the number of Episcopal or Anglican parishes plummets from somewhere in the 300s to somewhere in the 200s over the course of the Revolutionary War across all the states. So we're still talking about only a very small church, but it just contracted, it got smaller.
Okay, thank you, Ben.
Yeah. I'll come back and talk about the Oxford movement another time. Oh, thank you.
If anyone has extra hands, help set up for children.
Church, like West.